Fuzesi joins us from JP Morgan, where he is a Euro area economist. Past attendees may recall presentations from his colleague Malcolm Barr last year, as well as David Mackey before that. The economic backdrop in Europe could hardly be more complex between the war in Ukraine, looming energy shortages, soaring inflation, and rapidly slowing growth. Central banks around the world have an incredibly challenging task in their fight against inflation, none more so than the ECB, which is expected to some extent to agree a record 75 basis points hike in interest rates tomorrow, potentially. So Greg, no doubt, has a lot on his plate, so we very much appreciate you taking the time to join us today. Over to you, Greg.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. I head up the Euro area group at JP Morgan, responsible for the overall growth and inflation forecasts and also the ECB call. And one of the things I've been saying in recent months when I start talks like this is that this is a truly remarkable time. I mean, we have gone through one crisis after another, from the financial crisis to the sovereign crisis, trade wars. I would include Brexit in that. But this is the first time that we are being hit by multiple shocks at the same time and going in to some extent, in opposite directions. So trying to pin down forecasts and an outlook is incredibly difficult, not just for us, but also obviously for policymakers themselves. And this is the kind of thing I was saying 2 or 3 months ago when gas prices were, moving through the €100 per megawatt hour level. And then 10 days ago, we were leisurely going up towards 350. So this is even more true right now. It's just an incredibly volatile time at the moment, with massive shifts going on in the global economy. And that's the kind of message I want to try and convey. Now, I hope this works. Yep. Okay, so the first thing, just a few words about where we are globally. You can see on the left-hand side, there's kind of a probability decision tree, which is trying to send a message or convey our thinking about where we are in terms of global recession risks. And you can see that when you start off on the left-hand side, you either go left or you go right. And our judgment is that you go right, but it's a close call. So the baseline has kind of ongoing recovery in the global economy, but there is a risk of a stress-induced global recession already in the second half of this year. So things to note there are obviously the Euro area or Western Europe with the whole gas shock. You also have the zero COVID policy in China, which is still causing issues in terms of management in an environment where vaccine take-up or effective vaccine take-up is still quite low. And we've also had recession fears in the US in terms of the Fed tightening rates, pushing up market interest rates, slowing the housing market, and some of the data were flashing quite red a few weeks ago. Now, in terms of the second half of this year, I would say at the global level, things have probably improved overall, but there's been a rotation with recession fears in the US, at least imminent ones, receding. China also bouncing back from the earlier lockdowns, but then recession risks and recession itself actually going up as a risk in Western Europe. So there's been a regional rotation in terms of the second half of this year. Now, if you then follow the path towards the bottom, you then have another decision tree or a branch in 2023, 2024, which is where the bad outcome relates to central bank-induced recessions. So this is the whole debate about whether the inflation outlook has become so difficult even for the medium term that central banks actually need to cause some damage to their economies in order to push unemployment up and reduce medium-term inflation pressures. So even if you get through the next 6 months, there is still a question about the landing zone and what do central banks have to do in terms of slowing things down and even causing like monetary policy-induced recessions to ensure that inflation does actually return to 2% rather than just to 2.5% or something like that. Now there, you can see it's more of a 50-50 call, especially as you extend the time horizon forward. So 2023, 2024, our judgment is that there is almost a 50-50 chance that you have to have a central bank-induced recession. So the single most likely outcome is basically a recession later on or a soft landing. But it's obviously you've got issues both in the second half of this year and further out. So it's definitely a difficult outlook. Now, in terms of the regional rotation, I mean, the chart at the top right-hand side makes that incredibly clear, where if you look at energy prices, so indexed to 2018 levels, you can see that oil prices have gone up significantly. US natural gas prices have also gone up significantly, but nothing compares to what we're seeing in Western Europe. So clearly this is a big regional shock that is justifying if you look at the bottom right-hand side, a weaker growth forecast in Western Europe with some contraction in the fourth quarter and the first quarter of next year. So I'll spend a bit of time just going through the way that we're thinking about the Western European side of this, focusing in particular on the euro area, and then I'll say what the implications are for central banks from that. So the first this is just a table which shows the forecasts. So minus 2% annualized contraction in Q4 and Q1, an unemployment rate that at the moment is at a record low of 6.6%. It goes up to about 7.1, or half a point up through to the early part of next year, but then improves again because growth resumes. You have headline and core inflation, which are incredibly high. We're likely to go through the 10% barrier in the coming months. But then, unless energy prices have another leg up, from an inflation perspective, the price level will be permanently higher, but the inflation rate will come down because that looks at the change in the price level from one year to the next. So there is still the prospect or the forecast that inflation settles around the 2% target at the end of next year. But from the ECB's perspective, and apologies, this doesn't have one extra hike in there, you're clearly in the wrong ballpark if you have your policy rate at 0 at the moment. So between now and the end of the year, I think the ECB will have to raise rates to about 1.5%. Then it can probably pause, become a bit more growth sensitive, but then resume and raise rates all the way to 2% in the second half of next year, just to complete the normalization job. So this is just an overview of the euro area forecast. Now, the big near-term issue is obviously gas. And this is sort of where all efforts to try and put together a forecast start and get stuck. Because pinning down what the gas price will do in the coming hours even, is incredibly difficult given the huge volatilities that we've seen. Now, economists have spent quite a lot of time trying to estimate the impact of oil or gas shutdowns from Russia on the economy. And the impacts are clearly very large. I mean, top right-hand side, this is from the German Bundesbank. You can see that the level of GDP, and this was done in June, so timing-wise, things are obviously shifting. But if you have a shutdown of Russian gas kind of in June, which we didn't, but let's assume that we had that, the level of GDP on their estimate would have fallen 5%, a bit more than 5%, already in 2022. Now that's a massive decline, given that it has to come in the second half of the year. And half of that, you can see the bar at the bottom, the kind of the blue bit with the lines through it, that is the impact of gas rationing per se, where the regulator says, we're shutting down the chemical sector, we're shutting down the metal sector because they're using too much gas and we need to save it for the winter. Later on, you still have huge drag. So GDP, in their estimate, only recovers to 3.5% below the baseline in 23 and 24, because you still have the reverberations of the high energy price working its way through the economy, through uncertainty effects, purchasing power effects, and so on. And on inflation, at the bottom right-hand side, despite the massive collapse in GDP, their judgment is that inflation will still be higher even in 2024, even though a weak economy should really be reducing inflation pressures. So this is clearly a very, very difficult kind of setup here. Now, I have actually shied away from putting numbers on what the effect of shutdowns of gas flows could be. And the reason is that I think that this is actually a very fluid situation, because it matters hugely when you shut off the gas. Most people would not have expected German gas storage to be 86% full today or yesterday, even though flows through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline have already been running at only 20% of normal capacity, and have now been shut down completely. So there's no more gas flowing from Russia at all, and nevertheless Germany has managed to fill storage up to 86% of capacity. Now that covers a quarter of your annual consumption if you take your storage from 100 down to 0. You'll never do that all the way because you never want to be at 0, but it does cover a couple of months in the winter, and you still have flows coming from Norway. Germany is about to put in place mobile LNG import terminals, which also creates capacity to import natural gas, equivalent to about Nord Stream 1 running at 40% capacity. So the situation, in these estimates is you shut down the gas, you struggle to come up with any alternative, and then you work through your macro models, your input-output tables, and you just slash everything down in terms of output. But what we see is that the economy is actually a lot more flexible and adaptable to the situation, and policymakers have actually been quite successful at getting alternatives. And similarly, on the manufacturing side, 3 or 4 months ago, you had many sectors who were saying, well, we use gas and we have no alternative. And now some of them are saying, well, actually, we might be able to heat our furnaces with electricity. And these things do matter massively for what the impact of the shock would be. Now, just to put a bit of scaling on this, if you look at the chart at the top left-hand side, you can see that for a region that imports energy, you can look at the cost of the gas crisis in terms of your import bill. So how much more are you having to transfer abroad to get a certain amount of gas coming into your region? And you can see that the import bill for energy overall had fallen to about 200 billion in 2020, early 2021, which is about 1.5% of euro area GDP. And that looks like it's going to be shooting up to about 900 billion. So you're going from a situation where you're transferring 1.5% of your production value or your income abroad to get energy, and now you're having to transfer something like 7% abroad, 7.5. Now, you can picture that in terms of your own personal finances, just giving up an extra 5-6 percentage points of your income, and then seeing or imagining what you're going to do to adjust your spending. So it's a massive, massive shock. Now, this is why we have a forecast of recession at the turn of the year. Now, the best we can do at the moment, given the uncertainties, is basically track where we are. Now, what I would say just very briefly is if you look at the top right-hand side, and this area here is very, very messy because of the pandemic, but if you look at before, there's a good correlation between one of the main business surveys, which is the PMI survey, the orange line, and quarterly GDP growth. And you can see that there's been a significant weakening here, but the survey at this point, and this is August, is still pointing to some modest growth in the euro area economy. So recession risk, yes, but it's not yet in the data. Now, what we can already see is, for example, if you look at the two charts at the bottom, you have energy or gas usage in German manufacturing, which is running something like 10% or so below the average of recent years. And you can see in the IP data that the energy-intensive parts of German manufacturing are already underperforming the rest of the sector, with cars being on a slightly different planet because of the semiconductor shortage issue. But you can already see a difference in performance of energy-intensive and non-energy-intensive parts of German manufacturing. Chemicals in particular has declined in terms of output, and chemical imports have increased. So you're substituting domestic production for imports. Now, on the more consumer side, or just one last thing on the top left-hand side, you can also see a massive divergence in some of the surveys between, so this is in Germany in the IFO, between what companies are saying about their current situation, which has not really changed all that much, and their expectations, which are a complete disaster. So, the next 6 months they think will be really difficult, but they're not actually seeing that much of an impact just yet. On the consumer side, it's similar. If you ask consumers about their personal financial situation and their expectations for the economy, it's basically down here, even worse than during the pandemic. But in terms of people's view about the labor market and job security, it has weakened, but not really all that much. So even there, it's a bit more differentiated. Euro area retail sales, they are weakening, but from a very high level. And even if you take the headline measure of consumer confidence, you are looking at consumer spending falling at a 3% pace only. But as I say, there are some issues about the composition here. Now, just again to provide a bit of a balance, is there are also some positives still working their way through the system which are affecting the forecast. So the first is that we have not yet seen in the published data the full extent of the post-COVID rebound. There is still more to come, especially on tourism. In Spain, hotel stays are kind of back to normal. But if you look at US air traffic to Europe, there is still a wave of US tourists set to come over and give the tourism sector a further boost. We also have the situation of very, very high savings rates that we saw during the pandemic, where you simply couldn't spend on certain things. You couldn't go traveling, you couldn't go and do leisure services, and there were only so many computer screens that you can buy to compensate for that. So effectively, the household sector ended up cutting consumption, but disposable income actually held up much better. So you had abnormally high saving rates. And if you add up the excess savings that were made during the pandemic, they amount to something like 12% of disposable income. So again, the economy is having to transfer 6% of income abroad extra to get energy, but households have had a kind of an injection of 12% of their disposable income of cash, which is still sitting there somewhere. It's obviously not evenly distributed and all the rest, but it's not like that the starting position is a complete catastrophe. There's also positives in terms of the labor market. I mean, top left-hand side, employment in the euro area is above the pre-pandemic level. The recovery has been stronger than in the US. Unemployment is at a record low without any assistance from a fall in the participation rate. Companies are complaining about labor shortages. And I think we've all experienced the practical impact of that at airports over the summer. But it does mean that there could be reluctance on the part of companies to let people go because they will be worried about the difficulty of rehiring if the shock abates at some point. And that gives you a bit of resilience in terms of the labor market adjustment, and in some sense consistent with the strength in the labor market. At the bottom left-hand side, there has been a pickup in wage growth, which is also generating income for households. So, if you look at disposable income in real terms, it's flatlining, but that already includes a big inflation drag, which is to a large extent offset by a real acceleration in the nominal disposable income that households are earning. Now, this will obviously get worse because these are data through to the first quarter and there's more inflation pressure to come. But again, there is a lot of income being generated by the labor market that is helping to some extent. Another thing to watch is manufacturing, again, on the positive side, in terms of the bottlenecks issue from the past. If you take the German data, you have had a 2-year period where the level of industrial orders was running much higher than the level of production. And the flip side of that is that you've had a huge run-up. So you've had a huge run-up in the backlog of orders. So again, manufacturing is facing big pressures from the rise in energy prices, but it is sitting there with record levels of order backlog
that still need to be worked through. If you take, for example, Volkswagen, they announced, I think 3 or 4 months ago, that if you
want to order an electric VW, you have to join the queue for 2023. So again, that provides some scope for the industrial side to continue to grow if some of the older bottlenecks actually ease. Now, again, I don't think that will offset the drag from the energy side, but it does mean that the drag overall will be less because you've got other positive dynamics still working their way through the system. The basic point that I would like to make on inflation is that at the moment it clearly is a very, very difficult situation with inflation at double digits. In the UK, some people are now saying it could be 15, 16, 17% in terms of where you peak. But I still think this whole debate about transitory versus permanent is not yet completely dead. And what I mean by that is if you look in the decomposition of the inflation basket on the core side, you essentially have core goods where everything is going crazy. You have car prices, bicycle prices, furniture prices, everything has gone through the roof. because demand has been strong and supply has been very weak. And in some cases, the cost side has also been going up. So, wood prices have boosted furniture prices. This is what I'm talking about. You are massively out of any historical range in terms of core goods inflation, irrespective of which item you look at. Now, on the services side, there are similar charts. Accommodation prices, so hotel prices, restaurant prices, even rental inflation is starting to nudge higher. So you might very easily conclude, well, this is a very broad problem, and therefore central banks necessarily have to go into restrictive territory and really slow things down. And there's, you can make that argument also based on some more sophisticated measures of underlying inflation, which is at the right-hand side, top right-hand side. But what I would say is that a lot of these older measures of underlying inflation are not really that well suited for the pandemic context. So the two things that I look at instead are bottom left-hand side. It's a bit messy and you need to have a bit of goodwill to see the correlation, but there is an impact of high energy prices on core inflation, and it's not small. When energy prices go up, airfares get more expensive, transport prices go up, and so forth. So in the core basket, when you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, core inflation is 4.3%, I would say, yes, some of that does, however, include pass-through from high energy prices to core. The second is if you decompose the services basket into items you can link to the pandemic and other items, and the other items are basically 75% of the services basket, you see that here on the services side, it's still much more lopsided. That the non-pandemic inflation rate has only just gone above 2%, and the pandemic-related items are running at sort of 7%. This is where hotel, restaurant prices and airfares and package holiday prices come into it. So I would say that the extent to which the euro area inflation data have gone over the top is still more limited than it is, for example, in the UK and the US. Now, let me finish on the central banking side. Clearly, as I said at the beginning, whatever your interpretation of the near-term outlook and the inflation data, it is not the right place for the ECB to have the policy rate at zero. I think just from a credibility perspective, I think some people need to be shown that the central bank is on the case. Of course, raising rates is not the solution to the gas crisis, because that doesn't miraculously get gas more cheaply, and you're actually hitting other parts of the economy to compensate for the pressure. So you're using the wrong tool in some sense. The real tool is fiscal, or a ceasefire in some way in Ukraine. But you're still having to demonstrate that you're doing something and you're moving away from these very, very low rates. So for the next 2 or 3 months, I think the ECB does need to further raise rates, to reestablish its credibility. I would say that inflation expectations in the euro area as well are not yet unanchored. So the ECB hasn't yet kind of let things go too far on the upside. I do think that the recession or downturn over the winter will have a dampening effect on wage and price setting. It will take some of the froth out of pay settlements that are due to be done later on this year, which I think will give a bit of reassurance about the medium-term inflation outlook. And therefore, I don't think that inflation will necessarily settle above 2% at this point. Now, there are clearly a lot of other issues that some of the more hawkish members worry about, which is longer-term inflation pressures coming from climate change, the green transition, demographics at the global level, deglobalization, and so on. So there's enough there to keep you in some sense, up at night if you are worried about upside risks on inflation. And therefore, I think, even if you become more growth sensitive during the downturn, you will have to raise rates further later on, especially because I don't expect a huge damage to the labor market from the downturn that we are likely to see over the winter period. So rates are set for normalization, but in Europe at least, or in the euro area at least, I'm not yet convinced that they have to go into restrictive territory to really cause damage to the economy to hit the medium-term inflation target. That is a bigger debate in the US and the UK, especially with fiscal policy in the UK also set to provide a big offset to the gas drag. Now, in terms of balance sheet policy, this also argues for quantitative tightening. Now, I think this is already obviously happening in the US. It's happening in the UK. Again, I think euro area is a bit different because you've got Italy. So the ECB needs to be more careful in terms of what it does with the balance sheet to compensate for that. But the policy rate is effective at still making sure that your stance is at the correct level. So even though the ECB will be more cautious on the balance sheet, I think it will be able to set monetary policy at the right level overall. And I'll stop there just in the interest of time.